Today, we're diving into a powerful story of unexpected change and redemption. It all starts with David, a decorated soldier returning home from his latest deployment, ready to enjoy a rare first-class flight. But what should have been a moment of pride and relaxation turns into a heated confrontation when he faces unjust treatment from a fellow passenger, Lillian. Her discriminatory behavior sparks a series of events that not only challenges David's dignity, but also ignites a surprising chain reaction that changes both their lives forever. Why did David's calm response lead to such dramatic outcomes? How did this one incident expose deeper truths and inspire real change? Stay tuned to find out. And before we jump in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if this story of integrity and transformation moves you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. David exhaled slowly as he made his way through the airport, the weight of his duffel bag a constant reminder of the miles he'd traveled. His fatigued eyes scanned the busy terminal, taking in the mix of people rushing by. Most were in a hurry, heads down, preoccupied with their own lives. He, however, was calm. Tired, yes, but calm. It felt good to be back. After months overseas, risking his life in foreign lands, coming home to his family felt like the reward he had been waiting for. He walked with purpose, though his steps were a little slower than usual. The ache in his muscles, the stiffness in his legs, signs of a body that had been through more than most could imagine. Still, he carried himself with pride. His uniform, freshly pressed for the occasion, stood out amid the sea of travelers, drawing a few glances. But David was used to attention. In his line of work, it came with the territory. David held his first-class ticket tightly in his hand, the feel of the crisp paper reassuring him. It was a small luxury, a gift to himself after everything he'd been through. His mind briefly wandered to the day he bought the ticket. He had hesitated at first, knowing that his money could be spent elsewhere, maybe on something for his wife or his daughter. But after weeks of back-to-back missions and nights spent under the stars in a combat zone, he convinced himself that he deserved it. He had earned it. The seat in first class was more than just comfort. It was a moment of peace, a brief respite from a world of chaos. As he approached the check-in counter, the familiar sounds of the airport buzzed around him. The rolling of suitcases, the chatter of passengers, and the muffled announcements over the intercom. He flashed a tired but polite smile at the attendant, who quickly checked his boarding pass. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said, handing it back to him with a respectful nod. David simply nodded, accustomed to the well-meaning gestures. He appreciated them, of course, but he didn't need constant reminders of his service. All he wanted now was to get home, to see his family again, to hold his daughter in his arms. The thought of it made his heart ache with longing. Just a few more hours, he told himself. As he walked toward the first-class lounge, he couldn't help but reflect on everything he had endured. The long nights on patrol, the friends he had lost along the way, the weight of decisions that haunted him even now. But he also thought of the good moments, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose that had driven him to enlist in the first place. All those sacrifices had brought him to this moment, and in a few short hours, he'd be with his family. That was all that mattered. The first-class boarding area came into view, and David felt a small sense of relief wash over him. Finally, a chance to sit down and relax before the long flight. As he approached, his eyes briefly scanned the rows of plush seats. Most were already occupied by travelers, business people engrossed in their laptops, a few older couples reading or chatting quietly. His gaze, however, landed on a woman seated near the window. Lillian. She was hard to miss. Well-dressed in a tailored jacket and expensive-looking shoes, Lillian exuded an air of entitlement. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and designer handbag, perched on the seat beside her, completed the picture. Everything about her screamed wealth, from the gleaming watch on her wrist to the way she held herself. Chin raised just a little too high, eyes scanning the room as if she owned it. David didn't think much of her at first. He wasn't the type to judge people based on appearances. He had met all kinds during his time in the military. And if there was one thing he'd learned, it was that appearances could be deceiving. Still, as he made his way toward the empty seat next to her, he noticed her posture change. Her eyes locked on him, a slight narrowing of her gaze, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Excuse me," David said politely, as he stopped in front of the seat beside her. "I believe that's my seat." Lillian didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked him up and down, her expression one of thinly veiled disdain. For a moment, she seemed to consider whether she would even dignify him with a response. Finally, she spoke, her voice dripping with condescension. "Are you sure?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Her eyes flicked to his uniform, then back to his face. "This is first class." David's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Yes, I'm sure. This is my seat." Lillian leaned back in her chair, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. She looked him over again, this time with even more scrutiny. There was no mistaking the skepticism in her eyes. She clearly didn't believe that someone like him, someone who looked like him, belonged in first class. "Well, I find that hard to believe," she said, her tone light but laced with insult. "You must have made a mistake. This is for first-class passengers." David took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He had dealt with worse, far worse, in his time, and he wasn't about to let this woman ruin his day. Still, there was a part of him that bristled at her words, at the blatant disrespect she showed without even knowing him. He didn't deserve this, not after everything he had been through. "I didn't make a mistake," David replied firmly. "I have a first-class ticket, and this is my seat." Lillian pursed her lips, clearly unimpressed. She glanced around, as if expecting someone to come to her aid and remove him. When no one did, she let out a small, exasperated sigh. "Well, you'll have to forgive me for being skeptical," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, though still loud enough for him to hear. "It's just not what I expected." David narrowed his eyes slightly. He knew exactly what she meant by that. It wasn't the first time he had encountered someone who assumed things about him based on the color of his skin or the way he looked. But it didn't make it any easier to stomach. Before he could respond, the flight attendant approached, sensing the tension between them. She smiled politely at both of them, though her eyes flicked nervously between David and Lillian. "Is everything all right here?" the flight attendant asked, her voice cautious. Lillian was quick to speak up, her tone indignant. "I think there's been a mistake. This gentleman seems to think he's supposed to be sitting here, in first class, but I find that highly unlikely." The flight attendant looked at David, who handed her his ticket without a word. She examined it, her eyes widening slightly as she saw the seat assignment. "There's no mistake," the flight attendant said, her voice kind but firm. "This is Mr. Davis's seat." Lillian blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting that response. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, but she quickly recovered, her expression hardening. "Well, I just find that very unusual," she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for both David and the flight attendant to hear. The flight attendant, sensing that the situation was on the verge of escalating, offered a tight smile. "I assure you, ma'am, everything is in order. Mr. Davis, if you'd like to take your seat, we'll be boarding shortly." David nodded, grateful for the intervention. He stepped forward and placed his bag in the overhead compartment before taking his seat beside Lillian. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly unhappy with how things had played out. As David settled into his seat, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Frustration, anger, but also a sense of relief. He had faced far worse than an entitled woman with prejudiced assumptions, but it still stung. All he wanted was a peaceful flight, and already, things were off to a rocky start. He glanced out the window, trying to focus on the thought of home, on the idea of seeing his family again. But Lillian's presence beside him was a constant reminder of the biases that still lingered, even in places as ordinary as an airport. David took a deep breath and closed his eyes, determined to let it go. He had made it this far, and nothing, not even Lillian, was going to ruin the moment he had waited for so long. David sat quietly in his seat, staring out of the airplane window, trying to calm his mind after the brief exchange with Lillian. The woman's cold, judgmental attitude had gotten under his skin, but he wasn't about to let her ruin the day. After all, he had faced much worse in his life. This was just ignorance. He'd been taught to pick his battles, and this one wasn't worth it. Lillian, on the other hand, was far from done. She kept glancing at David out of the corner of her eye, her lips pursed in a tight line. Every once in a while, she'd let out a loud, annoyed sigh, making it clear that she wasn't happy with the seating arrangement. Finally, Lillian could no longer contain her frustration. She turned toward David, her voice sharp and cutting. "Are you sure you're supposed to be sitting here?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Her tone was accusatory, as if she was trying to catch him in some sort of lie. "I mean, this is first class." David's eyes flicked toward her briefly before returning to the window. He wasn't in the mood for a confrontation, but it was clear she wasn't going to let it go. "Yes," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm sure." Lillian scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "I don't know how you managed to get that seat," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "There must have been some kind of mix-up." David clenched his jaw, feeling the tension build in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on them, watching the scene unfold. He didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to be the center of attention, but Lillian was pushing him to the edge. "I didn't make a mistake," David said, keeping his voice steady. "I bought this ticket." Lillian crossed her arms, her expression a mix of disbelief and annoyance. "You bought a first-class ticket?" she asked, her tone incredulous. "I find that hard to believe." David took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He knew what she was implying, even if she hadn't come right out and said it. It was there, hanging in the air between them, thick with racial undertones. She didn't believe he belonged in first class because of the color of his skin. It was as simple as that. "Believe what you want," David said quietly, his patience wearing thin. "But this is my seat." Lillian huffed, clearly unsatisfied with his answer. She turned toward the aisle, waving down a flight attendant with exaggerated urgency. "I need you to check this man's ticket," Lillian demanded as soon as the flight attendant approached. Her voice was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, drawing even more attention to their row. "There's been some sort of mistake. He doesn't belong in first class." The flight attendant, a young woman in her mid-20s, blinked in surprise, clearly taken aback by the accusation. She glanced at David, her expression apologetic, before turning back to Lillian. "Ma'am, I've already checked his ticket," the flight attendant said, trying to remain professional despite the uncomfortable situation. "He's in the correct seat." "Well, I don't think that's right," Lillian insisted, her voice rising in pitch. "There's no way he paid for a first-class seat." David's grip tightened on the armrest, but he kept his mouth shut. He had nothing to prove to this woman. He knew his worth, and he wasn't about to let her words get to him. Still, it was hard not to feel the sting of her blatant disrespect. The flight attendant hesitated, glancing between David and Lillian. "Ma'am, I assure you, everything is in order," she said, her tone polite but firm. "There's no mistake." Lillian shook her head, clearly unsatisfied. "You need to check again," she said, her voice cold and insistent. "This man doesn't fit the profile of someone who flies first class. I don't know how he got this seat, but there's been some kind of mix-up, and I expect you to fix it." At those words, David felt a surge of anger flare in his chest. The racial undertone was no longer just implied. It was out in the open now, plain for everyone to hear. He glanced around the cabin, noticing how the other passengers were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between him and Lillian. Some of them looked embarrassed. Others looked as though they wanted to say something but weren't sure how to intervene. The flight attendant, to her credit, remained composed. She turned to David, offering him an apologetic smile. "Sir, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience," she said, her voice gentle. "Could I please see your ticket again, just to confirm?" David sighed quietly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his boarding pass. He handed it to the flight attendant without a word, watching as she carefully examined it. A few moments later, the flight attendant looked up, nodding. "Everything is correct," she said, turning back to Lillian. "This is Mr. Davis's seat." Lillian's face flushed with irritation. She opened her mouth to argue further, but the flight attendant quickly cut her off, her tone becoming more authoritative. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to please stop harassing Mr. Davis. His ticket is valid, and he has every right to be in this seat. If there are any further issues, I will have to involve the captain." Lillian's mouth snapped shut, her eyes blazing with indignation. For a moment, it looked like she might continue to argue, but then she seemed to think better of it. With a huff, she crossed her arms and sank back in her seat, glaring at the seat back in front of her as if it had personally offended her. David let out a quiet breath, feeling the tension in the air start to dissipate. The flight attendant handed him back his ticket with a sympathetic smile. "Thank you for your patience, sir," she said softly. "I'm truly sorry for the inconvenience." David nodded, appreciating her professionalism. "It's not your fault," he said quietly. The flight attendant gave him a small nod before turning to leave, her posture stiff with the effort of maintaining her composure. David watched her walk down the aisle, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. He was glad the situation hadn't escalated any further, but the sting of Lillian's words still lingered. He settled back into his seat, determined to focus on the positive. He was almost home. Soon, he'd be with his wife and daughter, and all of this would be a distant memory. He just needed to make it through the next few hours. But Lillian wasn't finished. Even though the flight attendant had put her in her place, she couldn't seem to let go of her anger. She turned toward David once more, her eyes narrowing. "You know, this whole thing is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for David to hear. "I don't know why everyone's making such a big deal out of this. It's just a misunderstanding." David didn't respond. He didn't see the point in engaging with her any further. It was clear that nothing he said would change her mind. "I mean, it's not like I said anything that bad," Lillian continued, her voice dripping with self-righteousness. "People are so sensitive these days. You can't say anything without someone getting offended." David clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to respond. He knew that anything he said would only make things worse. Instead, he focused on keeping his breathing steady, reminding himself that this was just a temporary situation. Soon, he'd be off this plane and far away from Lillian's toxic presence. Lillian seemed to take his silence as an invitation to continue. "It's not like I was being rude," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I just asked a simple question. It's not my fault if people jump to conclusions." David finally turned to look at her, his eyes hard. "You didn't ask a question," he said quietly, his voice low and controlled. "You made an assumption." Lillian blinked, clearly taken aback by his directness. For a moment, she seemed to consider her response, but then her expression hardened. "Well, excuse me for being surprised," she snapped. "I don't usually see." David held up a hand, cutting her off. "You don't need to explain," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I know exactly what you meant." Lillian stared at him, her mouth open in shock, as if she couldn't believe he had the audacity to speak to her that way. For a moment, it looked like she was going to respond, but then she snapped her mouth shut, turning away from him with a loud, annoyed huff. David shook his head, turning back toward the window. He wasn't about to let her bait him into a confrontation. He had dealt with people like Lillian before, people who hid their prejudice behind thinly veiled comments and condescending smiles. He knew better than to let it get to him. As the minutes ticked by, David tried to lose himself in his thoughts, focusing on the excitement of seeing his family again. But it was hard to fully relax with Lillian sitting just inches away, radiating hostility. A few rows ahead, an older couple exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the air. A young man with earbuds and stared at his phone, but his posture suggested he was keenly aware of the situation. Other passengers shifted in their seats, casting furtive glances toward David and Lillian, as if unsure of how to react to what they had just witnessed. David knew that this moment would linger in the minds of those who had seen it. For some, It would be a reminder of the subtle ways racism could rear its ugly head, even in everyday situations. For others, it would be an uncomfortable encounter that they would try to forget as soon as they stepped off the plane. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, David took one last deep breath, determined to leave the confrontation behind. The wheels lifted off the ground, and soon the plane was soaring into the sky, carrying him closer to home. But even as the city below faded from view, the weight of Lillian's words still hung heavy in the air. The tense silence following the confrontation between Lillian and David settled over the first-class cabin like a heavy fog. Lillian, still fuming, had crossed her arms and turned her body slightly away from David, as though the mere sight of him offended her. She stared at the sea back in front of her, occasionally shifting in her seat, her frustration evident in the stiff way she carried herself. But David had long stopped paying attention to her. His focus had shifted inward, away from the woman who had attempted to strip him of his dignity and toward the familiar feelings that her actions had stirred in him. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed out the small window as the ground below grew more distant. The engines hummed steadily, their rhythmic sound oddly calming in the midst of everything that had transpired. Unbeknownst to either David or Lillian, a silent observer had been watching the entire scene unfold from just a few rows behind. Robert was a well-known businessman, his face familiar to anyone who paid attention to the news or the world of philanthropy. Though dressed in casual clothes for the flight, he exuded an air of quiet authority, the kind that comes with experience, wisdom, and a certain level of success. He had boarded shortly after Lillian and David, slipping into his seat with little fanfare, unnoticed by most of the passengers around him. As Robert had taken his place, he had quickly become aware of the tension between the two passengers seated ahead of him. Lillian's haughty demeanor had been hard to miss, and her escalating comments had drawn his attention. At first, he had watched with mild curiosity, wondering if the disagreement was a simple misunderstanding. But as the exchange between Lillian and David had continued, Robert's curiosity had given way to disgust. The condescension in Lillian's voice, the assumptions she had made about David, and the way she had demanded that the flight attendant verify his ticket. It was all too familiar. Robert had seen people like Lillian before, people who wore their entitlement like a badge of honor, who believed their wealth or status made them inherently superior to others. It was a mindset he despised, one that he had fought against his entire life, both in his business dealings and in his charitable work. As a philanthropist, Robert had dedicated much of his time to causes aimed at addressing inequality and promoting social justice. He had always believed in using his influence to create change, but in moments like this, he felt the weight of how far society still had to go. He had wanted to intervene, to say something that would shut Lillian down and offer David the support he deserved. But something had stopped him. Perhaps it was the way David had handled the situation. Calm, composed, with a quiet strength that spoke volumes. Robert had recognized that kind of restraint, the kind that came from years of learning how to navigate a world where you were often judged before you even opened your mouth. He had seen it in friends, colleagues, and even in himself at times. So, Robert had chosen to remain silent for now, observing as David maintained his composure despite Lillian's provocations. It wasn't his place to step in, not yet. David had handled the situation with dignity, and Robert respected that. But that didn't mean he would let it go unnoticed. He had a growing sense of determination as he watched Lillian simmer in her seat, her lips pursed in silent frustration. As the boarding process continued, other passengers began to settle into their seats, some casting uneasy glances toward the front of the cabin, where the tension between Lillian and David still lingered in the air. It was clear that many of them had witnessed the confrontation, but like Robert, they had chosen to remain silent. Whether out of discomfort or a desire to avoid getting involved, no one had spoken up. The unease was palpable, but no one dared to address it. David, for his part, was doing his best to ignore the stares. He had been in situations like this before, and he knew how to endure them. His years in the military had taught him patience, resilience, and the importance of picking his battles. And this, as frustrating as it wasn't a battle worth fighting. He had nothing to prove to Lillian or anyone else in that cabin. He knew who he was, and he knew the sacrifices he had made. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, David leaned his head back against the seat, his thoughts drifting to his time in the military. It was hard not to reflect on it now, given the irony of the situation. He had spent years serving his country, fighting for the very freedoms that allowed people like Lillian to express their prejudiced views without consequence. And yet, despite his service, despite the medals and commendations he had earned, he was still seen as less than simply because of the color of his skin. It wasn't a new feeling. David had grown up facing discrimination, and even as he rose through the ranks in the military, he had encountered moments where his worth was questioned or diminished because of his race. But he had learned to rise above it, to focus on the things that truly mattered: his family, his comrades, and the values he held dear. He had fought for his country not because he believed it was perfect, but because he believed in the possibility of making it better. As he sat there, staring out the window at the endless sky, David couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration. How many more times would he have to prove himself? How many more moments like this would he have to endure? He had given so much to a country that still, in so many ways, refused to see him as equal. But then he thought of his family, his wife, who had stood by his side through every deployment, and his daughter, who had grown up far too fast in his absence. They were the reason he had kept going, the reason he had endured every hardship, every moment of doubt. And soon, he would be home with them again. That was what mattered most. He shifted in his seat, glancing over at Lillian, who was still fuming silently. She hadn't spoken to him since the flight attendant had verified his ticket, but her body language spoke volumes. It was clear that she hadn't let go of her resentment, but David was done engaging with her. She could stew all she wanted. He wasn't going to let her ruin this moment for him. As the flight attendants began to move through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers, Robert continued to watch from his seat behind Lillian. He had been reflecting on the incident as well, thinking about how often situations like this occurred, even in spaces that were supposed to be more progressive or inclusive. It was a reminder that no matter how much progress had been made, there were still deep-seated issues that needed to be addressed. But Robert wasn't the type to just sit back and do nothing. He had spent too many years fighting for change, and he wasn't about to let this moment pass without action. He had seen David's quiet strength, his refusal to let Lillian's words diminish him, and it had left a lasting impression on him. Robert had always believed in recognizing people who embodied the values of resilience, dignity, and integrity, and David was a perfect example of that. As the flight attendants moved past his row, Robert made a decision. He wasn't sure exactly what he was going to do yet, but he knew he had to do something. He couldn't just let this moment pass without acknowledging what had happened, without offering some kind of support to the man who had shown such grace in the face of blatant disrespect. For now, though, he remained silent, content to watch and wait. He had learned long ago that timing was everything, and there would be a moment, soon, he hoped, when he could make his move. But for now, he would let David have his peace. He had earned it. As the flight continued, David found himself lost in thought once again. His mind wandered back to his last deployment, the missions he had completed, and the men and women he had served alongside. He thought about the camaraderie they had shared, the way they had relied on each other in the most dangerous situations. In the military, race had mattered far less than loyalty, trust, and the ability to do your job. It was a stark contrast to the world outside, where people like Lillian could still judge him without knowing anything about him. But David also knew that change was possible. He had seen it in the small, everyday moments, the way his comrades had stood up for each other, regardless of their backgrounds, the way they had come together as a team, united by a common purpose. And he believed that the world outside could learn from that too. It was slow, it was painful, but it was possible. As the plane continued its journey, David closed his eyes, letting the hum of the engines lull him into a state of quiet reflection. He didn't know what the future held, But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let people like Lillian hold him back. He had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to be diminished by her narrow-mindedness. And as he sat there, unaware of the silent witness watching from behind, he had no idea that this flight would soon take a surprising turn, one that would remind him that there were still people in the world who believed in doing the right thing. Robert, too, remained deep in thought, his gaze fixed on the back of Lillian's seat. He had seen enough, and he was ready to act. But for now, he waited, his mind already forming a plan for what he would do once the plane touched down. The flight might have been quiet, but beneath the surface, something much bigger was brewing. And neither David nor Lillian had any idea just how significant this journey would become. The plane's wheels touched down on the tarmac with a soft thud, the sound of the engines shifting as they prepared to taxi to the gate. The long flight was finally over, and for many passengers, the relief was palpable. But for David, it wasn't the end of just another journey. It was the end of an experience he wouldn't soon forget. He had remained calm throughout the entire ordeal, maintaining his dignity in the face of Lillian's arrogance. But as the plane began to slow, the exhaustion of the past few hours caught up with him. He stretched slightly in his seat, feeling the tension in his shoulders. It had been a long deployment, and all he wanted now was to reunite with his family. He pictured his wife's smile, the way his daughter would run up to him, arms wide, and that made the wait for the plane to come to a complete stop even harder. Across the aisle, Lillian was already gathering her things, her posture stiff and her face still set in that same look of superiority. She hadn't spoken a word to David since the flight attendant confirmed his ticket, and though her silence should have been a sign of retreat, she seemed convinced she had come out of the situation victorious. To her, David's calm had likely been seen as submission. She, after all, had not apologized or acknowledged her mistake. As passengers stood and began retrieving their luggage from the overhead bins, Lillian gave David a quick, disdainful glance before turning her back to him entirely. She had no idea who she had been seated next to, a decorated soldier, a man who had given years of his life to serve his country. But that didn't matter to her. All she saw was what was on the surface, and she was content in her ignorance. David, on the other hand, had already moved on. He gathered his carry-on bag and stood, giving the cabin one last glance. The other passengers, some of whom had watched the earlier exchange in discomfort, now seemed eager to disembark. There was a tension in the air that no one wanted to acknowledge. As they filed out of the plane, David felt the weight of their stares, but he paid them no mind. He had more important things on his mind: home, family, and the end of a long journey. As he stepped into the terminal, the cool air of the airport hit him, and for the first time in hours, David allowed himself to breathe a little easier. He was almost there, almost home, but as he began to walk through the terminal, something unexpected happened. From behind him, a voice called out, firm but polite. "Excuse me, sir? David, isn't it?" David turned to see a man approaching him, dressed in casual clothes, but with an air of quiet confidence. He didn't recognize the man at first, but then the memory clicked. The man had been seated a few rows behind him on the plane, a silent observer during the earlier incident with Lillian. "Yes," David said cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, extending a hand. Robert Davis." David shook his hand, still unsure of where this was going. There was something familiar about the name, but he couldn't quite place it. "I was on the flight with you," Robert explained, his tone calm but serious. "I saw what happened with that woman, Lillian, was it?" David nodded, his expression neutral. "Yeah, I remember." Robert hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "I just wanted to say, I was impressed by how you handled yourself. That kind of grace in a situation like that, it says a lot about your character. Most people would have lost their temper." David shrugged slightly. "I've dealt with worse. It's not worth the energy." Robert's eyes softened with understanding. "I can imagine you have. But still, I wanted to tell you what you did mattered. To me, and I'm sure to others who saw it." David wasn't used to receiving compliments like this, especially from strangers, so he shifted slightly, unsure of how to respond. "I appreciate that, but really it was nothing." "No, it wasn't nothing," Robert said firmly. "And I want to talk to you about something, if you have a moment." David raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Robert motioned for him to walk with him, leading the way through the terminal. "I run a charity organization. We focus on helping veterans and supporting minority-owned businesses. And after seeing how you handled yourself back there, I think you'd be a great fit for a role we have. It's something I'd love to discuss with you." David was taken aback by the offer. He had expected this conversation to be short, maybe a quick thank you from a fellow passenger who had witnessed the incident. But this was something entirely different. He followed Robert as they walked, curiosity piqued. "What kind of role are we talking about?" David asked, his voice cautious but intrigued. Robert smiled as they reached a quieter part of the terminal, away from the crowd. "We're always looking for people with strong leadership skills, people who can inspire others and help guide our mission. You clearly got those skills. I saw it back on the plane. You didn't let her words shake you. And that's exactly the kind of resilience we need." David listened closely, still processing everything. "I've done my time in the military. I was planning on taking a break, focusing on my family for a bit. And I respect that," Robert said quickly. "But this wouldn't be full-time. It's something you could do on your own terms. And the impact you'd have, it would be significant." David wasn't sure what to say. The idea of working for an organization that helped veterans and minority-owned businesses appealed to him, but it was so sudden, so unexpected. He had just been trying to get home, to put the entire incident with Lillian behind him. But now, it seemed like that moment was leading him somewhere new, somewhere he hadn't anticipated. "What kind of impact are we talking about?" David asked after a pause. Robert's eyes lit up. "We're working on several initiatives right now. One of the biggest is a mentorship program for veterans transitioning to civilian life. You'd be able to guide them, help them find their footing, and share your own experiences. We're also working on grants for minority-owned businesses, giving them the support they need to get started or expand." David nodded slowly, his mind racing as he considered the possibilities. He had always wanted to do something more after the military, something that would allow him to continue serving in a different way. And this opportunity, it felt like it had come out of nowhere, but maybe that was the point. Robert must have sensed his hesitation, because he added, "Look, I don't expect you to give me an answer right now, but I'd love for you to come to a meeting with the team, see what we're about. I think you'd be impressed with what we're doing." David looked at Robert, still uncertain, but beginning to feel a sense of excitement growing. "A meeting, huh?" Robert grinned. "Yeah, we're based not far from here. How about tomorrow? No pressure, just come by and see what we're working on." David considered it for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll come by." The two men shook hands again, and as they did, David felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't just a random encounter. It felt like something more, like a door opening to a new chapter in his life. And as he walked away from Robert, heading toward the exit to finally reunite with his family, he couldn't help but feel grateful for the unexpected turn his journey had taken. The next day, David arrived at the address Robert had given him, a modest but professional-looking building tucked away in the heart of the city. He wasn't sure what to expect, but as he walked through the doors, he was immediately greeted by a sense of warmth and purpose. The walls were adorned with photos of veterans and their families, alongside images of smiling entrepreneurs cutting ribbons in front of their new businesses. Robert met him at the entrance, greeting him with the same easygoing smile from the day before. "Glad you made it," he said, leading David through the building to a conference room where a few other members of the team were already seated. The meeting began, and as David listened to Robert and the others discuss the various projects they were working on, he felt himself becoming more and more invested. The work they were doing was important, providing real, tangible support to veterans and minority-owned businesses in ways that could change lives. And as the conversation continued, David began to see how he could fit into that picture. When the meeting ended, Robert turned to David with a hopeful look. "So, what do you think?" David smiled, feeling more certain than he had in a long time. "I think I'm in." In the weeks that followed, David took on his new role with the organization, using his experience and leadership skills to help guide veterans through their transitions and support the growth of minority-owned businesses. It was challenging work, but it was also deeply rewarding, and David found a renewed sense of purpose in it. As for Lillian, she remained unaware of the ripple effect her actions on that plane had caused. She had walked away from the encounter convinced she had won, but in reality, her behavior had only fueled David's determination to make a difference. And as David continued his work, he knew one thing for sure. No matter how people like Lillian tried to bring him down, he would always rise above. As David settled into his new role at Robert's Charity, little did he know that the incident on the plane was about to take on a life of its own. Unbeknownst to both David and Lillian, a fellow passenger had discreetly recorded their altercation using a smartphone. The video, capturing Lillian's condescending remarks and David's dignified response, was about to set social media ablaze. The passenger, a young college student named Alex, had been seated a few rows behind David and Lillian. Initially hesitant to get involved, Alex had felt compelled to document the exchange, sensing its significance. After deliberating for a day, Alex decided to share the video online, hoping to spark a conversation about racial prejudice in everyday situations. Within hours of being uploaded, the video went viral. It spread like wildfire across various social media platforms, garnering millions of views and sparking heated discussions. The hashtag #FirstClassRacism began trending, with people from all walks of life weighing in on the incident. Comments flooded in, overwhelmingly in support of David. This man's composure in the face of such blatant disrespect is incredible. True strength right there. How can people still act like this in 2024? Disgusting behavior from that woman. I hope the airline bans her for life. This kind of racism has no place in our society. As the video continued to circulate, it caught the attention of major news outlets. Soon, the story was being featured on national broadcasts, with anchors and commentators dissecting the incident and its implications for modern society. One news anchor introduced the segment, saying, "A shocking display of racial prejudice aboard a first-class flight has ignited a nationwide conversation about privilege and discrimination." The video, which has now been viewed over 10 million times, shows a woman, identified as Lillian Hartley, questioning a black man's right to sit in first class. The public's reaction was swift and decisive. People were outraged by Lillian's behavior, with many calling for consequences. It didn't take long for internet sleuths to identify Lillian and her employer, a prominent marketing firm in New York City. As the backlash intensified, Lillian's employer found itself at the center of a PR nightmare. Their social media accounts were flooded with angry messages demanding action. The company's CEO, Sarah Thompson, quickly realized the severity of the situation. In an emergency meeting with her executive team, Sarah paced the room, her face etched with concern. "We need to address this immediately," she said, her voice tense. "Our silence is being interpreted as complicity." One of the executives spoke up. "Maybe we should wait for things to blow over? These internet storms usually die down after a few days." Sarah shook her head firmly. "No, we can't afford to wait. Our company values explicitly state our commitment to diversity and inclusion. If we don't act now, we're hypocrites." After a heated discussion, the decision was made. Sarah drafted a public statement condemning Lillian's actions and announcing her immediate termination from the company. The statement read, "We at Thompson Marketing are deeply disturbed by the video circulating online featuring one of our employees. The behavior displayed goes against everything our company stands for. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. Effective immediately, Lillian Hartley is no longer employed by our organization." As news of Lillian's termination spread, the public's reaction was mixed. Many applauded the company's swift action, while others debated whether the punishment fit the offense. The incident sparked broader discussions about accountability in the age of social media and the role of employers in policing their employees' behavior outside of work. Lillian, who had been blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her, was blindsided by her sudden termination. She arrived at work one morning to find her access card deactivated and security waiting to escort her from the premises. In a state of shock, Lillian tried to defend herself to her former colleagues. "It's all a misunderstanding," she exclaimed, her voice shrill with panic. "They're making it into something it's not." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. As she was let out of the building, the reality of her situation began to sink in. The comfortable life she had known was crumbling around her, all because of a moment of prejudice caught on camera. In the days that followed, Lillian's life became a nightmare of public scrutiny and personal crisis. She was recognized on the street, with people hurling insults and accusing her of racism. Her social media accounts were flooded with angry messages, forcing her to shut them down. Even her friends and family began to distance themselves, not wanting to be associated with the controversy. Desperate to salvage her reputation, Lillian agreed to an interview with a local news station. Sitting across from the interviewer, her usual confidence was replaced by a nervous energy. "Ms. Hartley," the interviewer began, "what do you have to say about your actions on that flight?" Lillian shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I realize now that my behavior was inappropriate," she said, her voice quavering. "But I want people to know that I'm not a racist. It was just a misunderstanding." The interviewer pressed on. "But the video clearly shows you questioning the gentleman's right to be in first class based on his appearance. How is that not racist?" Lillian's facade cracked. "I was tired. I wasn't thinking clearly," she stammered. "I've never had any problems with people of color before. I have black friends." Her weak attempts at justification only fueled the public's anger. Social media erupted with memes and parodies of her interview, further cementing her status as a symbol of entitled racism. As Lillian faced the consequences of her actions, David's story was taking a very different turn. The same video that had exposed Lillian's prejudice had also showcased David's remarkable composure and dignity. People were impressed by his ability to remain calm in the face of such blatant disrespect. Robert Charity, sensing an opportunity to expand their reach, decided to make David the face of their new anti-discrimination campaign. They launched a series of videos featuring David, sharing his experiences, and discussing the importance of treating all people with respect and dignity. In one of these videos, David spoke directly to the camera, his voice steady and sincere. "What happened to me on that flight isn't unique," he said. "People of color face these kinds of microaggressions every day, but we have a choice in how we respond. We can let it break us down, or we can use it as fuel to drive positive change." The campaign resonated with people across the country. David's message of resilience and hope in the face of adversity struck a chord with many who had faced similar experiences. Donations to the charity skyrocketed, allowing them to expand their programs and reach even more veterans and minority-owned businesses. David found himself thrust into the spotlight, invited to speak at conferences and events across the country. At first, he was hesitant about the attention, preferring to focus on the work rather than his newfound fame. But he soon realized that his platform could be used to make a real difference. During one particularly impactful speech at a national conference on racial equity, David addressed a packed auditorium. "The incident on that plane was just a moment," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "But it represents a much larger issue in our society. We need to have honest conversations about race and privilege. We need to challenge our own biases and stand up against discrimination wherever we see it." The audience erupted in applause, many rising to their feet in a standing ovation. David's words were having a tangible impact, inspiring people to examine their own behaviors and work towards creating a more inclusive society. As David's influence grew, so did the reach of Robert's charity. They partnered with major corporations to implement diversity and inclusion training programs. They expanded their grants for minority-owned businesses, helping to create jobs and stimulate economic growth in underserved communities. And their veteran support programs flourished, providing crucial assistance to those who had served their country. One day, As David was leaving a meeting at the charity's office, he ran into Robert in the hallway. Robert clapped him on the shoulder, a proud smile on his face. "You know, David," he said, "when I saw you on that plane, I knew you were something special. But I had no idea just how much of an impact you'd have." David smiled back, a mix of humility and determination in his eyes. "I'm just glad I can use my experience to help others," he replied. "Every day, I'm reminded of why this work is so important." As they walked together towards the exit, Robert chuckled softly. "You know, in a strange way, we almost owe Lillian a thank you. Her actions that day set all of this in motion." David shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think we owe her anything, but I do hope she's learned something from all this. Maybe in some small way, this whole experience has opened her eyes." As they stepped out into the sunlight, David couldn't help but reflect on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this point. From a moment of discrimination on a plane to becoming a voice for change, his life had taken a turn he never could have anticipated. But as he looked at the charity's building behind him, emblazoned with their motto, "Empowering Change, Embracing Diversity," he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The incident that had started it all, a moment of prejudice caught on camera, had sparked a national conversation. It had cost Lillian her job and her reputation, serving as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked bias. But it had also elevated David, turning him into a symbol of grace under pressure and a catalyst for positive change. As David drove home that evening, he thought about the many lives that had been touched by the charity's work. Veterans finding their footing in civilian life, minority entrepreneurs getting the support they needed to thrive, and countless individuals inspired to confront their own biases and work towards a more inclusive society. He couldn't help but smile at the irony. Lillian's attempt to diminish him had instead propelled him into a position where he could make a real difference. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the most challenging moments in life could lead to the most unexpected and rewarding opportunities. As he pulled into his driveway, David saw his wife and daughter waiting for him on the porch. Their faces lit up as he stepped out of the car, and he was once again reminded of what truly mattered: family, purpose, and the chance to leave the world a little better than he found it. The public backlash against Lillian and the subsequent rise of David's influence had created a ripple effect, touching lives far beyond the confines of that first-class cabin. It was a testament to the power of standing up against injustice, and a reminder that one person's dignity in the face of discrimination could inspire millions. As the dust began to settle on the viral incident, the ripple effects of that fateful flight continued to spread, touching lives far beyond David and Lillian. The video had sparked a national conversation about race, privilege, and accountability, leading to unexpected consequences and opportunities for many involved. For David, life had taken on a new rhythm. His work with Robert's charity had become more than just a job. It was a calling. Each day brought new challenges and rewards as he worked to expand the organization's reach and impact. On this particular morning, David found himself preparing for a meeting with a potential corporate sponsor, a Fortune 500 company interested in partnering with the charity for a nationwide diversity initiative. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, David caught sight of the framed newspaper article hanging on his office wall. The headline read, "From First-Class Confrontation to First-Class Citizen, David Thompson's Journey." He shook his head, still amazed at how a moment of adversity had led to such positive change. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Robert, looking excited. "David, you ready? The CEO of Grayson Industries is waiting in the conference room." David nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." As they walked to the conference room, Robert filled him in on the details. Grayson Industries has been under pressure to improve their diversity practices. They're hoping our partnership can help them turn things around. Entering the conference room, David was greeted by a familiar face, Sarah Thompson, the former CEO of the marketing firm that had fired Lillian. She stood as they entered, extending her hand with a warm smile. "Mr. Thompson, it's an honor to meet you," Sarah said, her voice sincere. "Your story has been an inspiration to many, including myself. David shook her hand, surprised by the connection. Miss Thompson, I believe we have a mutual acquaintance. Sarah's smile faltered slightly. Yes, I suppose we do. The incident with Lillian, it was a wake-up call for our entire organization. It made us realize we needed to do more than just talk about diversity and inclusion. We needed to live it. As they sat down, Sarah explained that she had left her position at the marketing firm to take on the role of Chief Diversity Officer at Grayson Industries. Your story made me realize I wanted to be part of the solution, not just react to problems, she said. The meeting progressed, with Sarah outlining Grayson Industries' plans for a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program. They wanted to partner with David and Robert Charity to provide training, mentorship, and support for minority employees and entrepreneurs. As David listened, he couldn't help but marvel at the chain of events that had led to this moment. The woman who had fired Lillian was now sitting across from him, seeking his expertise on creating a more inclusive workplace. It was a powerful reminder of how a single moment could spark widespread change. After the meeting, as Sarah was preparing to leave, she paused at the door. Mr. Thompson, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you, she said, her tone becoming more serious. It's about Lillian. David felt a flutter of unease in his stomach. He hadn't thought about Lillian in months, deliberately avoiding news about her after the initial media frenzy. What about her? He asked cautiously. Sarah sighed, her expression a mix of concern and frustration. She's been struggling to find work since the incident. The video, it's followed her everywhere. I recently heard she's been reduced to working minimum wage jobs, barely making ends meet. David listened, unsure how to respond. Part of him felt a twinge of sympathy for Lillian, despite everything that had happened. Another part reminded him of the hurt and humiliation he'd felt that day on the plane. Sarah continued, I know she hurt you, and what she did was inexcusable. But I can't help wondering if there's a way to turn even this into something positive. Maybe there's an opportunity here to show what true forgiveness and growth look like. David raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. What are you suggesting? What if we offered Lillian a chance to make amends? Not just a public apology, but a real opportunity to learn and change. She could go through our new diversity training program, maybe even share her story as a cautionary tale. Sarah paused, gauging David's reaction. It could be powerful, showing that people can learn from their mistakes, that cancel culture doesn't have to be the end of the story. David leaned back in his chair, considering the proposal. It was a bold idea, and not without risks. But wasn't that what their work was all about? Challenging people to confront their biases and grow? Let me think about it, David said finally. It's not a decision to be made lightly. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of what she was asking. As she left, David turned to Robert, who had been silent throughout the exchange. What do you think? David asked. Robert stroked his chin thoughtfully. It's risky, he admitted. But if it works, it could be transformative, not just for Lillian, but for everyone who sees it. It's easy to write someone off as a lost cause. It's much harder, and perhaps more important, to offer them a path to redemption. Over the next few days, David wrestled with the decision. He talked it over with his wife, seeking her wisdom and support. She reminded him of the values that had guided him throughout his life and career: compassion, forgiveness, and the belief in people's capacity for change. Finally, David made his decision. He called Sarah and agreed to move forward with the plan, but with conditions. Lillian would need to commit to a comprehensive education program, not just a one-time training. She would need to demonstrate real change, not just pay lip service to diversity. And most importantly, she would need to agree to use her experience to educate others about the harm caused by prejudice and discrimination. Sarah was elated. Thank you, David. I believe this could be the start of something truly transformative. The next step was to approach Lillian. Sarah took on this task, tracking her down to the small apartment where she now lived. The Lillian she found was a far cry from the confident, entitled woman from the plane. Months of public scrutiny and professional rejection had taken their toll. When Sarah explained the proposal, Lillian was initially skeptical, even hostile. "Why would he want to help me?" she demanded. "Is this some kind of trick to humiliate me further?" Sarah shook her head. "No, Lillian. This is a genuine offer, a chance to make things right, to learn and grow from your mistakes. But it won't be easy. You'll have to confront some hard truths about yourself and your actions." Lillian was quiet for a long moment, tears welling in her eyes. "I've lost everything," she whispered. "My job, my friends, my reputation, all because of one stupid moment. I never thought of myself as a racist, but now I don't know what to think." Sarah placed a comforting hand on Lillian's shoulder. "That's a start," she said gently. "Recognizing that we all have biases, that we all have room to grow. That's the first step. The question is, are you willing to take the next step?" After a long pause, Lillian nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I am." Over the next few months, Lillian underwent an intensive education program. She attended workshops, read books, and had difficult conversations about race, privilege, and unconscious bias. It wasn't easy. There were moments of defensiveness, of backsliding into old patterns of thinking. But slowly, surely, she began to change. The culmination of the program was a face-to-face meeting with David. Both were understandably nervous as they sat down in a neutral location, a small conference room at Grayson Industries. Lillian spoke first, her voice shaky but determined. "David, I don't even know where to begin. What I did to you that day was inexcusable. I was arrogant, prejudiced, and cruel. I'm deeply, deeply sorry." David listened quietly, his face impassive. When Lillian finished, he leaned forward, his gaze intent. "Lillian, I appreciate your apology, but I need to know, what have you learned from this experience? How have you changed?" Lillian took a deep breath. "I've learned so much," she began. "I've learned about the daily microaggressions that people of color face. I've learned about my own privilege and how I've benefited from systemic racism without even realizing it. But most importantly, I've learned that being not racist isn't enough. We have to be actively anti-racist, challenging our own biases and standing up against discrimination wherever we see it." As Lillian spoke, David could see the genuine change in her. The entitled woman from the plane was gone, replaced by someone humbled and eager to learn. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments where her old biases shone through, but the transformation was undeniable. "Thank you, Lillian," David said when she finished. "I can see you've done a lot of work on yourself. But you know this isn't the end, right? This is just the beginning of a lifelong journey." Lillian nodded, her expression serious. "I know, and I'm committed to continuing this work, not just for myself, but to help others learn from my mistakes." In the weeks that followed, David and Lillian worked together to develop a new program for Grayson Industries and the charity. They would share their story, the incident on the plane, the fallout, and the journey of growth and reconciliation as part of diversity training sessions. Their first joint presentation was nerve-wracking for both of them. Standing in front of a room full of Grayson employees, David and Lillian took turns recounting their experiences. Lillian spoke first, her voice steady despite her nerves. "A year ago, I was a different person," she began. "I thought I was a good person, an open-minded person. But one moment on a plane revealed the ugly truth of my own biases." As she recounted the incident, many in the audience shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing aspects of themselves in Lillian's story. Then it was David's turn. He spoke about the pain of being judged and dismissed based on his race, about the weariness of constantly having to prove himself worthy of spaces like first class. But he also spoke about the power of resilience, of turning adversity into opportunity. "What happened that day was painful," David said, his voice strong and clear. "But it led to something powerful. It sparked conversations, it created change, and it showed that even in our darkest moments, there's potential for growth and redemption." As they concluded their presentation, the room erupted in applause. Many employees approached them afterward, sharing their own experiences and pledging to do better in their own lives. Over time, David and Lillian's story spread beyond Grayson Industries. They were invited to speak at conferences, universities, and other corporations. Their journey of conflict, growth, and reconciliation became a powerful tool for teaching about racism, privilege, and the potential for change. One evening, after a particularly impactful presentation, David and Lillian found themselves sitting in a quiet corner of a hotel bar, reflecting on how far they'd come. "You know," Lillian said, swirling her glass of water thoughtfully, "a part of me will always be ashamed of what I did that day. But I'm grateful for where it led me. I'm a better person now than I ever was before." David nodded, understanding the complex mix of emotions. "That's the thing about growth," he said. "It's often painful, but it's always worth it." Lillian smiled ruefully. "I just wish it hadn't taken such a public humiliation for me to learn these lessons." "Maybe that's part of your purpose now," David suggested, "to help others learn these lessons without having to go through what you did." As they continued to talk, a young woman approached their table hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tinged with nervousness. "I saw your presentation earlier. I wanted to thank you both. It made me realize some things about myself that I'm not proud of, but it also gave me hope that I can change." David and Lillian exchanged a glance, both feeling a sense of validation. This was why they did this work, to spark those moments of self-reflection and change. As the young woman walked away, Lillian turned back to David. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Alex hadn't recorded that video?" she asked. "If none of this had come to light?" David considered the question for a moment. "I try not to dwell on what-ifs," he said finally. "But I like to think that everything happens for a reason. Maybe we needed to go through all of this to get where we are now." Lillian nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know, when this all started, I thought my life was over. I never imagined I'd be here, doing this work. It's funny how life turns out sometimes." "It is," David agreed. "But that's the beauty of it, isn't it? We never know where our actions might lead us. All we can do is try to make the right choices, learn from our mistakes, and keep moving forward." As they sat there, an unlikely pair brought together by a moment of conflict, both David and Lillian felt a sense of purpose. They had taken a painful incident and transformed it into a force for positive change. It wasn't always easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but they were committed to the journey. Their story had become more than just a viral video or a cautionary tale. It had become a testament to the power of education, empathy, and the human capacity for growth. In a world often divided by race and privilege, David and Lillian's journey offered a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the face of prejudice and discrimination, there was always the possibility of learning, changing, and coming together. As they left the bar that night, stepping out into the cool evening air, David and Lillian felt a sense of optimism about the future. They had come so far from that day on the plane, but in many ways, their journey was just beginning. There were more stories to share, more minds to open, more hearts to change. And as they parted ways, each heading back to their respective hotel rooms, they carried with them the knowledge that their unlikely partnership was making a real difference in the world. One presentation at a time, one conversation at a time, they were helping to build a more understanding, more inclusive society. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of tension and discomfort. But David and Lillian had learned that those moments of discomfort were often where the most growth happened. They had learned to lean into the difficult conversations, to challenge themselves and others to do better. As David lay in bed that night, reflecting on the day's events, he couldn't help but marvel at the strange twists and turns his life had taken. From a decorated soldier to a victim of discrimination to a catalyst for change, it had been quite a journey. He thought about the young woman who had approached them in the bar, and the countless others who had shared similar stories of revelation and growth after hearing their presentation. It was a powerful reminder of why this work was so important. Across town, in her own hotel room, Lillian was having similar thoughts. She looked at herself in the mirror, remembering the entitled woman she had once been. The journey of self-reflection and growth had been painful at times, but she wouldn't trade it for anything. As both David and Lillian drifted off to sleep that night, they felt a sense of purpose and hope. They knew that there was still much work to be done, many more minds to open and hearts to change. But they were ready for the challenge. Their story, a story of conflict, growth, and ultimately reconciliation, had become a powerful tool for change. And as they looked to the future, both David and Lillian were committed to continuing their work, to using their experiences to help build a more understanding, more inclusive world. It was a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is always the potential for growth and transformation. That with education, empathy, and a willingness to change, we can overcome our biases and build bridges across the divides that separate us. As the city slept around them, David and Lillian rested, ready to face another day of challenging conversations and transformative work. Their journey was far from over, but they were on the right path, a path of understanding, growth, and hope for a better future. David's story of dignity in the face of injustice sparked a remarkable transformation, influencing not just those directly involved, but also resonating with many who heard about his experience. The unexpected turn of events revealed deep truths and led to a powerful message of redemption and change. If David's journey moved you, be sure to subscribe for more stories of courage and impact. And before you go, we'd love to hear from you. How do you think you would have handled a similar situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below.